We all have routines. I'm Jabron, and with diabetes, mine was finger sticks. Sometimes, I skip them because it hurt. The Freestyle Libre 3CGM changed that. It gives me glucose insights without finger sticks. Learn more at freestylelibre.us.
Finger sticks are required if your glucose alarms or readings do not match symptoms, or when you see check blood glucose symbol for the first 12 hours. The views expressed should not be used for medical diagnosis or treatment as a substitute for professional medical advice. Individual circumstances may vary. For prescription only. Safety info found at freestylelibre.us.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.
At the time, when the Declaration was drafted, a lot of attention was paid to the list of grievances. And today, people don't normally pay much attention to the list of grievances. For one thing, some of them are so obscure that people don't understand what they mean. But in another, the focus today and the focus subsequently became on the important statement of ideals that begins the Declaration, which I think Pauline shows was simply the preface, expressed the ideas that were out there in the zeitgeist at the time, which they didn't pay a lot of attention to. And we tend to pay attention to those.
Hi, and welcome to episode 448 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. I'm your host for today, Joe Edelman. After Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, and sent it to printer John Dunlap for distribution, they decided that they also wanted to have the document written out or engrossed so that they could sign a parchment copy. That way, they could preserve the document and also make clear that each of the delegates to Congress was indeed willing to pledge his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. So on July 19th, 1776, they tasked Timothy Matlack, a New Jersey-born clerk working in the Pennsylvania State House, with the job. 2 weeks later, he finished, and on August 2nd, 1776, members began to sign the document. The first was John Hancock, the President of Congress, who made his name large and prominent across the center of the page. Over the next few weeks and months, as Emily Sneff explained in episode 439, other delegates signed it, including some who hadn't even been in Philadelphia on July 4th. In the years that followed, the Parchment Declaration faced a rough path. Congress carried the document with them when they abandoned Philadelphia just before the city's capture by the British in 1777. It was then at various times stored or displayed in ways that would make modern conservationists dizzy. By 1820, the document was already quite faded. So the Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, commissioned engraver William Stone to create a replica. The process he used further damaged the parchment and ink, but by 1823, Stone completed his work and produced 200 copies of the engraving. By law, Adams sent copies of the engraved printing to each state, to every living signer, and to the living former presidents, including his father, John Adams. The engrossed copy continued to appear on display on the walls of government buildings, then found its way to the Library of Congress, and eventually the National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. As we conclude our series of episodes marking the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Liz and I wanted to focus on the version that most people consider the original Declaration and how it came to occupy such a hallowed place, both literally and figuratively, in American life. The Declaration became American scripture, a phrase coined by the historian Pauline Maier in her 1997 book of that name. Both Liz and I adore that book, so we wanted to devote an episode to Pauline's insights. As you may know, however, Pauline Maier died in 2013, but her longtime friend, Beth Norton, graciously agreed to help us and to serve as Pauline's representative. The two scholars met as graduate students at Harvard in the 1960s, and though they never published anything jointly, they were consistent collaborators and interlocutors for each other for almost 40 years. So Beth is the perfect guest to help us explore Pauline Maier's work on the Declaration. In the episode, Mary Beth reveals what Pauline Maier wanted to accomplish by writing a book about the Declaration of Independence and how her work shifted the way historians think about the document. How Americans created many declarations of independence in 1776 before Thomas Jefferson picked up his pen for Congress. And how and why the Declaration became American scripture. But first, let's hear from Liz with some announcements.
Thanks, Joe. Friends, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for caring about early American history. Ben Franklin's World is a listener-supported podcast. We're independent, which means no algorithms or organizations tell us what stories we can and cannot talk about on this podcast. This means we have the ability to tell you the complete history, a history that includes the voices of the famous, the everyday, and those who existed on the fringes of early American life. You make this editorial flexibility possible. So if this podcast has become part of your life, if it's something you turn to during your commute, your walk, or your quiet Sunday morning, we'd really appreciate your support. A gift in any amount helps us keep bringing you these conversations that you enjoy week after week. You can make a tax-deductible donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And if you've already given, thank you. Truly, your generosity is what makes our work possible. And a special thank you to Michael H., John H., Carrie H., Ruth H., Nancy H., and Stephen H. for your generous support. Thank you. Thank you for helping us keep this work going.
Our guest is the Mary Donlin Alger Professor Emerita at Cornell University. She's an award-winning historian who has served as president of the American Historical Association and is a pioneer in the field of women's history. You may remember her from several earlier appearances on Ben Franklin's World, where we discussed her scholarship on the Fourth Tea Ship of Boston, her book 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, and her edited volume, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, Letters on Love and Marriage from the World's First Personal Advice Column. Mary Beth Norton, welcome back to Ben Franklin's World.
I'm glad to be here, Joe.
Thank you for joining us for this final episode in our series on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Our topic today is the signed Parchment copy, which is currently on display at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. And I just want to start by asking you to describe your own experiences of viewing the Declaration in the Archives Rotunda over the years. Are there any particular memories you have? What's it like for a scholar of the American Revolution to visit that Charters of Freedom exhibit in D.C.?
Well, I have to say that I was thinking about this, and when did I first see the Charters of Freedom exhibit? And I think it was when I was a high school student and my family took a trip to Washington, D.C. And I just remember being in awe of the display. But I have to admit that subsequently, I really haven't gone back. I have worked in the archives many times, but have I stood in line to go see the Charters of Freedom again? No, not really. Maybe once or twice, maybe once. I don't remember. But I do remember seeing people in line, little children with their parents, and looking at the exhibit and thinking sort of how nice that is. But I have to say that when I read Pauline's description in the book, or reread it for this occasion, I was really struck by how she talks about it and talks about how, in many ways, she doesn't really say this, but how strange it is in a lot of ways. It's intended to inspire awe, but it's documents. It's not as though there's anything really significant there except all those pieces of parchment, because, of course, it's not just the Declaration. And she doesn't comment about it, but the description is brilliant. I thought it really makes people think. It sort of made me think again about what those documents mean or have meant or what people want them to mean for us today.
And that's a great segue, because as Liz and I were talking about how to manage an episode about the Parchment, we both immediately thought of the phrase American Scripture, which comes from Pauline Maier's 1997 book, American Scripture. And unfortunately, it's one of my regrets. I never actually met Pauline before she passed away in 2013.
That's too bad. Yeah.
It is in many ways. But one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you is you are a contemporary of her, and you were both graduate students at Harvard studying with Bernard Bailyn in the 1960s. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience was as a graduate student with her, as a female graduate student in the 1960s, working with Bailyn?
Sure. Well, I actually kept a diary when I was a graduate student, and in connection with being asked to speak at MIT for the memorial service that they had for her in 2013 after she died, I went back to my diary to see if I could figure out when we actually met and had I listed it. And I did. I wrote about it in my diary, and it was in October of 1966. I was in my second year as a graduate student. She was ahead of me by several years. She was older, and she also had 2 children while she was in graduate school, which was truly amazing. But I had heard about her because I wrote in my diary that today I met Pauline Maier, who I've heard about, and she and I bonded immediately about our experiences working with Bailyn. We then sort of hung out a little bit, and there were times when we would end up working at the same time at the Harvard Houghton Library, the manuscript library. So I would see her around. That day that I met her was a day when we were TAs, and we were invited to the Harvard History Department meeting when they would invite the TAs to come to certain meetings. And we were both TAing, and that's the context in which I originally met her. But I have to say that we became really close, not so much when I was a graduate student, because she finished the year before I did. The year that she was finishing her dissertation, I was actually in England researching mine. And so she got her degree in 68 and I got mine in 69. And when we became really close was the first 2 years of my career. I was teaching at the University of Connecticut, just down the road from Boston, and she was at UMass Boston. I remember vividly, I used to drive up to Cambridge for the weekend and stay with her and her husband, Charlie. And we would talk to all hours of the night about early American history and sort of drive Charlie crazy. So that's when we truly bonded, I would say, was when we were both young assistant professors, although we did know each other as graduate students. And you asked about our relationship with Bailyn. We were his only 2 female graduate students at the time. It turns out he had another one earlier, but that woman had started with his predecessor, with the admiral, and he didn't really have much of a relationship with her. She wasn't there physically. She was just writing her dissertation elsewhere. And as a result, Pauline and I were it as far as women graduate students at the time working with Bailyn. And we would run into each other in the stacks at Widener Library and talk about our interactions with him because we found him rather awkward in dealing with us. And we decided it was because he just wasn't accustomed to dealing with women. Now, of course, that changed later after we both got our degrees, but also because Charlie became a member of the Harvard History Department. And so she started to know Bud, as I now call him, but of course I never called him that when I was a graduate student. We both got to know him in very different circumstances. But in the beginning, we did have a sense that he was really awkward in dealing with us.
Well, first, I will note for any listeners who don't know who the Admiral is, that's the Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morison.
Right. I should have said he was always known as the Admiral.
Which is fine. But for those who are not into Harvard lore, to fill that name in. So you went off to teach at UConn and then eventually Cornell. Pauline Maier moved to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and in the 1990s decided to work on this project on the Declaration of Independence. She writes in the introduction to American Scripture that she took on the project as what she described as a, quote, modern history of the Declaration, something that could be a small book for advanced high school and college students. So, Mary Beth, can you situate us in the 1990s? Before Pauline's book, what was the state of historians thinking about the Declaration?
It's interesting. I think it was very much still developed from Carl Becker's famous book on the Declaration, which he originally published in the 1920s and then revised in the 1940s. That was certainly what I studied when I was a student, was Becker's book on the Declaration. And his book very much focused on the writing of the Declaration. He was, after all, an intellectual historian, not a social historian. And so the whole thing was very different, really, from the way Pauline put the Declaration in context. I don't think anybody who wrote between Becker and Pauline had ever really replaced Becker as an author. Now, what had happened was that the Jefferson papers under Julian Boyd had produced very detailed editing and so forth of the editorial process, but it wasn't the sort of thing that you would pick up as a casual reader. It was part of the voluminous Jefferson papers project. So there was really nothing before it that matched Becker's book before Pauline's.
You mentioned context just now and putting the Declaration in context. And that's something that in rereading the book, and I also re-listened, we did an episode about 10 years ago as part of a series on the Revolution about Pauline's work overall. One of the sections of American scripture that really stands out for people is the chapter on other declarations, because she found 90 other lowercase d declarations from 1776 in municipalities and colonies across North America declaring their own independence. So how did Pauline use those local declarations, that broader context of people declaring independence, to reshape our understanding of the capital D Declaration?
Well, as I myself reread the book in the context of this conversation, I was very struck by that same chapter showing the other declarations of independence. And she focuses largely on Massachusetts. But I have a funny story to tell about that, because she subsequently, after her death, Ray Raphael came out and talked about interactions she had with him when he pointed out to her after the book was published that Worcester, Massachusetts had actually, in effect, published a Declaration of Independence in 1774, which she had missed. And it was not in her list or her conversations about previous declarations of independence. So that led to a very interesting relationship between the two of them, and they became very close friends after he chided her for having missed this declaration by the people of Worcester in the fall of 1774. So I have to say that when I reread that chapter, I was really struck by how much it accords with my own findings in my book, 1774, and the way that I found that I put it as people were voting with their feet in the fall of 1774 without formal declarations, but they were beginning to move away from the empire. I should say one other thing. Pauline knew when I was working on 1774, she knew that. I had told her about it, and she was so enthused about my doing it. And I was so looking forward to being able to talk to her and exchange chapters with her and so forth while I was working on the book. And then she died. So I was not able to do that. But we'd had several long conversations in the spring of 2013 before her illness. And I was really looking forward to having her feedback as I was working on my book. And then it didn't happen. But I was, again, really struck by how what she found in her chapter on the other declarations and how it accorded with what I found as the year 1774 progressed.
And as I recall from reading the book, she didn't declare it to be the final list of declarations that she found. No. And she was a careful enough scholar that I'm sure she was totally fine with having that list amended by further discoveries.
Oh, yeah, she was. In fact, Ray Raphael has a very interesting memory of this, in which a memoir that he wrote briefly, which I actually found somewhere and printed out. And she made fun of herself, in fact, by talking about what he had found and how she had missed it.
Which happens to all of us.
Yes, exactly.
Putting ideas in context is a broader theme of Pauline's work. And I know reading American scripture and reading her first book, From Resistance to Revolution, was methodologically an inspiration for me in thinking about early in graduate school and working on towards thinking about my approach to history. And it's one of the virtues of her scholarship that a number of the people we talked to, including you, in episode 155, was the way that she brought the ideas, the thinking behind the revolution outside of the rooms where Congress met and looked at how they intersected with the actions of ordinary people. So for just a moment before we go back deep into the Declaration, can you tell us a little bit more about why Pauline thought about that as part of her overall scholarly project?
remember, as you said earlier, we were graduate students in the 1960s. And Pauline in particular was very much affected by the scholarship that was coming out of England at the time about the actions of what we might call the people out of doors. That is, people who were in the streets making statements, political statements, as well as other kinds of statements about the politics of the time in Europe. And so she was very greatly affected by that. And you can really see that in her book, From Resistance to Revolution, because that's what she's doing. She's talking about not just the organization of the Sons of Liberty, which the way it started, by the way, that was the way her dissertation started. It was going to be about the Sons of Liberty, and then it broadened to become much more than that, and to show, in fact, that the Sons of Liberty is an organization has been, in effect, overrated as a controlling factor, and that Samuel Adams has been, as she says later in her book on the old revolutionaries, that he's been overrated as a leader of the mob. And in fact, he was just one of the many people who was involved, and that the Sons of Liberty as an organization, in fact, many times could not control what the people were doing and argued with what the people were doing, denigrated what the people were doing. And so from the beginning of her research, really, she had this theme, which was she was interested in what ordinary people thought. And that's what you see in American scripture, which is very different, going back to Carl Becker, very different from what Carl Becker did. Very different.
There are very few people in Becker's book.
Yes, that's right.
But she does not. I now have a segue to Jefferson. So we're going to go from ordinary people to profoundly unordinary people. At the end of his life, as you know, and as probably most of our listeners know, Jefferson wanted the world to think of him as the author of the Declaration of Independence. Right. But in 1776, at this contingent moment when it's being written, he was the first man to put pen to paper as the draftsman and did not claim authorship. How does Pauline interpret those weeks in June when Jefferson was drafting and the committee and then the full Congress were revising and adopting the Declaration?
It's another collective discussion. I mean, she, again, emphasizes the collectivity, not just the collectivity of the other declarations, but the collectivity of the people who are involved in drafting the Declaration. I mean, she makes that point that Jefferson used ideas that he had expressed earlier in the Virginia Constitution, the Constitution he drafted for Virginia, in things that George Mason had written, and so forth. And so she talks about him not as a person coming up with these ideas, but as someone who is melding ideas that are out there and taking from a whole variety of different places, including the actions of the other people who are involved, Franklin and the others later on, the actual Congress itself, who are editing the draft. And she makes the comment repeatedly that the other people greatly improved what Jefferson had written. They honed the prose, they made the phrases more felicitous, and so forth. And I went back and again, in thinking about this, was how when Pauline died, her obituary in the Times, the headline read, "Woman who said Thomas Jefferson was overrated." But it goes back to what she was saying in American scripture about the collective involvement of people, not just Jefferson, in the drafting of the Declaration.
So as the Declaration gets drafted, it gets adopted on July 4th, 1776.
Let's put it this way. It's first adopted on the 2nd of July, later on readopted in effect, or the very final language is adopted on the 4th.
Yes. And one of the times I have sympathy for John Adams of his July 3rd letter to Abigail, that July 2nd will be forever celebrated as Independence Day.
And then when it gets quoted, they never say what he said that about July 2nd.
But on July 4th, they sent it to the printer, to John Dunlap. And Liz talked earlier this year with Emily Sneff, who's got a new book about the Declaration and how it circulated out then from Philadelphia. All of that in print and being reproduced along the way. But after that, Congress employed Timothy Matlack to prepare a version of the Declaration on parchment in calligraphy that the delegates would then sign. And you and I were talking before we started the recording, and Pauline notes, that's a little weird that they took that step. The Declaration was published. It was public. It was out there. Why, after it was already public, did they go, in some ways, backwards to manuscript and have this document prepared in this way?
I think it's because they wanted people to make sure they knew it was authentic, that the manuscript version seemed to be more authentic than something that was just published in numerous newspapers, in part because there were the signatures that were added at the end, but also in part because, well, this is still a time, although I hate to say this for jokes since you worked on print a lot, although it's a time of printing, there's also lots of times that people are writing things that are not being printed when print can be modified in various ways and a manuscript can't be, not at least without people recognizing it. So I would say that it was to guarantee the authenticity, to show people that this was an authentic document. And I might add here that you may not know this, or the listeners to this podcast may not know, that the American Philosophical Society, of which Jefferson was in fact a president eventually, has commissioned a new version of the Declaration done by an artist that is with the text of the Declaration decorated by the seals of all the current states, all the 50 states. It's a really wonderful piece of art, and it is available for purchase. Not that I'm doing a advertisement for it here, but I've seen it, and it's really quite lovely. But it is, again, a version to show something that is more than just a sort of standard print copy.
Yeah, and I know John Bidwell published a book about 19th century reprintings of the Declaration, and many of them take this decorative form. I did not know about this APS version. I'll make sure to let somebody there know that you should get a commission. The one that I think is most fascinating to me is the parchment calligraphy in the shape of George Washington's head.
Yes, the artist of this APS version used some of those. I mean, she didn't copy them, but she was inspired by them.
Mm-hmm. The thing I like about the Washington one is the sort of clever irony that he wasn't there in Philadelphia. He had nothing to do with the Declaration.
Right. He was off being head of the army.
Mary Beth, we need to take a moment to thank our episode sponsors. But after that, I'd like to share a sample of Pauline's writing and get into the details of how she saw the Declaration becoming American scripture.
If you've ever had to stop yourself from going on too long about something you heard on this podcast, because not everyone in your life shares your enthusiasm for early American history, I have a place for you. The History Explorers Club is a virtual community for curious adults who want to explore, discuss, and genuinely indulge in early American history. No scholarly background is needed. Just bring your curiosity and your questions. And you can talk to us all day long about what you heard on this show. Now, members of the club get access to 2 live historian events each month, quarterly workshops, monthly club calls, and a 24/7 forum where the conversations are really smart, respectful, and endlessly interesting. Membership is $33 a month or $333 a year, which gets you 2 months free. To learn more about the History Explorers Club or to join, visit historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. I can't wait to see you there.
One of the things I always enjoy is Pauline's writing. And so I want to make sure we share a brief passage of the book so anyone who hasn't read it can get a sense of her writing. Early in chapter 4, which the title of that chapter is American Scripture, she writes the following. How the word went out is one story. What became of the Declaration afterward is another, more complex and of continuing significance. The Declaration was at first forgotten almost entirely, then recalled and celebrated by Jeffersonian Republicans, and later elevated into something akin to Holy Writ, which made it a prize worth capturing on behalf of one cause after another. The politics that attended its creation never entirely left its side, such that the Declaration of Independence, which became a powerful statement of national identity, has also been at the center of some of the most intense conflicts in American history, including that over slavery, which threatened the nation itself. In the course of those controversies, the document assumed a function altogether different from that of 1776. It became not a justification of revolution, but a moral standard by which the day-to-day policies and practices of the nation could be judged. That, at its essence, is what it means to describe the Declaration as American scripture. Right? That it's this holy text in American civil life. It's this moral standard that we hold ourselves to. How did that process, in a little more detail, come about that it went from it's this printed document that circulates that has a very specific function to holding the highest ideals of the nation, whatever that means.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that's so interesting about all of this and about that particular paragraph that you read is that at the time when the Declaration was drafted, a lot of attention was paid to the list of grievances. And today, people don't normally pay much attention to the list of grievances. For one thing, some of them are so obscure that people don't understand what they mean. But in another, the focus today and the focus subsequently became on the important statement of ideals that begins the Declaration, which I think Pauline shows was simply the preface, expressed the ideas that were out there in the zeitgeist at the time, which they didn't pay a lot of attention to. And we tend to pay attention to those. And so, for example, one of the important places subsequently was paid attention to was at Seneca Falls in 1848, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other people at the Women's Rights Convention there deliberately rewrote the Declaration very explicitly, beginning with all men and women are created equal, and then going on to list a series of grievances that women would have against men. So it was a very, very deliberate copying and modeling, using the Declaration as a model. And that was sort of the beginning, I think, of the way in which people have used it. She also talks, I think, very eloquently in the book about Lincoln's use of the Declaration, especially through recalling it at the Gettysburg Address. And then subsequently, of course, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and other writings that he had. So the language of the Declaration, the beginnings of the Declaration have become an important hallmark, and they continue to be to this day as people refer to it.
The book's now been out almost 30 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I first read it, I'm a little younger than you, so I read it first when I was an undergraduate, but enjoyed it at that point. Since 1997, what's the impact for scholars working on the Declaration? What impact do you think the book has had on scholars working on the Declaration and the Revolution?
I think it really is the collectivity of it. Again, the emphasis away from the individual work of Jefferson and towards the work of the Congress as a whole, or the editing committee as a whole. And again, this issue of setting it in context, showing that this just didn't appear like a flash of lightning. It was, in fact, expressing the ideas that had taken over the nation, or the nascent nation, we might say, at that time. And not just because the war had started, but because people had reached this conclusion on their own. That's where I think the emphasis is. Interestingly, that the book called American Scripture turns out to have had its most impact as something that is more general and showing the way in which the so-called scripture expressed consensus rather than individual ideas.
Thank you for that summary. And that's a really good point about the way in which the focus on the single document opens up a world of experiences. You've been very generous, Mary Beth, to talk to us about mostly the work of a friend and colleague and serve as her voice. But I don't want us to leave the conversation without invoking your own scholarship on the American Revolution just a little bit, since we're talking about the Declaration. We won't have another 250th. Over the course of your career, you've studied the Loyalists. You've written extensively several books about the experience of women. And then, as you mentioned earlier, you published this book on 1774 as a long moment of crisis that led up to the outbreak of war. So based on your own scholarship, how do you situate the Declaration of Independence within the context of the American Revolution?
As I said earlier, I'll just repeat what I said before, which is that I was struck by how much it accords with what I thought the direction of American thought was at the end of 1774 or at the beginning of 1775. I was, in my own work, really struck by the number of letters from the governors of the colonies who wrote to England in late 74, early 75, and said, I can't do anything anymore. These people will not obey me. There's no point in putting any orders out there because they will just ignore them. And basically, the governors all indicated, And this was unanimous among the royal governors who were in America at the time, saying, I'm throwing up my hands. There's nothing I can do with these people. And so that's why I said, I think in the book, that they were voting with their feet. And what we see in Pauline's book is the culmination of that and the formalizing of it through the formal votes for independence, which people were not doing in 1774, but they were acting more independently. And one of the things that struck me in my own work, if I can say a little bit about that, is that I came to the conclusion that this all developed over the summer of 1774. It's really not there in the beginning of 1774 or at the time of the Boston Tea Party, which a lot of people go back to in late 1773. There was a slow evolution of people's ideas so that by the end of the summer of 1774, in the things that I read, I began to see more and more people thinking about the possibilities of American colonies that were not subject to Britain, not necessarily a nation. But one of the things I discovered was that the simple use of language sometimes, because in 1773, I would say people, when they used the word my countrymen, they meant people in their colonies. By the end of 1774, when they used that term, they were thinking about all Americans. It's a quite dramatic change of rhetoric and a way in which people were thinking about things. And so, again, I really regret that Pauline didn't live to think about what I was finding with me and to help me think about it, because I've realized, again, rereading her book, how much she found. I found the precursor to it. Let's put it this way. I found the precursor to it, and I wasn't thinking about it in those terms when I wrote my book. And I would have been had she lived, and we'd been able to have a discussion about it.
Which is one of many sadnesses about losing Pauline when we did. Not to mention that listening to the two of you would have been a fascinating conversation to eavesdrop in on. We now have a segment called 1776 in Context, and we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and thinking about the resonances. So just based on both American scripture and your own work on the founding era, what role would you like to see in 2026 for the parchment copy of the Declaration in American life? Is there still a usefulness to having it serve as a form of scripture?
I think where it serves is the statement of principles. It continues to be something that is a beacon for people, the notion of equality of men, and I would add women, and the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. I think those things stuck with us and stick with us and will continue to stick with us, I hope.
Very much the same, same sentiment. So at the end of our interviews, we ask about future work. I will note, and we'll put links to Pauline's 4 books. From Resistance to Revolution was the first one, then The Old Revolutionaries, American Scripture, which we've talked about today, and then Ratification, which is another fantastic book.
Yes, it's a wonderful book.
About the ratification debates. But Mary Beth, what are you working on these days?
Well, I'm really retired, or I'm trying to retire. Well, a friend of mine, when I was talking to her the other day about what I was doing, she said, I thought you were retired.
It's fair. You're entitled.
After my book on the lovelorn letters, as I called it, and I talked about in a previous podcast for Ben Franklin's World, I have returned amazingly to the letters of a loyalist woman that I first discovered in my work on my dissertation. Her letters are very interesting for a whole variety of reasons. Her name is Christian Barnes, and she is a resident of Marlborough, Massachusetts. Her husband's a merchant in Marlborough. And she writes these really interesting letters in the late 1760s, early 1770s, to a very close friend of hers who's traveling in Scotland. And so she's telling more things than she normally would say in correspondence because she has to fill her friend in on what's going on. And so she makes various comments about the politics of the time, which I find fascinating as a scholar of the Loyalists, which I continue to be interested in after all these years. And the letters, which I discovered when I was a graduate student, they've been used by people. They have been quoted extensively sometimes, but never printed in full. And I'm doing a digital edition of them for the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. That's my project at the moment. It's, in fact, my summer project this year. I will say Zara Anna Sondland used them very successfully in her new book, The Painter's Fire, because it turns out that Christian Barnes and her husband owned an enslaved man who turns out to be an important painter and is a major figure in Zara's book. So that's another reason why her correspondence is interesting, because it conveys detailed information about the life of this enslaved painter that she and her husband owned, and that they do send to England to be trained by professional artists. There's an aspect of it that I hadn't even thought about when I was looking at it as a source for my dissertation, because my dissertation was on the Loyalists who went into exile, as you know, and she and her husband went into exile. And so what I was mostly interested in for my dissertation was the letters that she wrote from Bristol after she and her husband escaped from Massachusetts.
As you noted earlier, I'm mostly a scholar of print, so I will say it this way. Just like newspapers, letters can contain such a wide-ranging and rich base of material and conversation about all sorts of subjects, sometimes even in one letter, right? So,
yes, absolutely. And again, because her friend was traveling abroad, she put things in letters that would not have been put in them otherwise if her friend had just been down the road in Boston instead of traveling in Scotland.
Well, Mary Beth, thank you for serving as Pauline's voice for us to talk about the wonderful book that she wrote about the Declaration of Independence. And thank you for sharing your time with us. It's always enjoyable to talk with you.
Well, thank you, Joe. I wish I could channel Pauline better because she was a dear friend. And as I said, I continue to miss her.
Pauline Maier dedicated her career to understanding the American Revolution and to describing it clearly. As Mary Beth Norton explained, Pauline especially focused on explaining how Americans took the ideas and ideologies that lay behind the revolution and put them into practice in the real world. For Pauline Maier, Thomas Jefferson was important as the man who wrote the text of the Declaration, but ordinary people mattered because they gave the words life and meaning in their homes and communities. I keep thinking back to two things of my own experience with the Declaration. First are the times that I've been to the National Archives and visited the Charters of Freedom exhibit. It's an awe-inspiring experience, not least because the National Archives sets it up that way. If you've never been, you enter the building through the ground level and pass through security, then make your way upstairs to a gorgeous, dimly lit, quiet room with marble all around you. Significant documents from American history line the curved wall with the Declaration and Constitution right at the center. Everyone maintains a respectful silence, even when there are throngs of school kids around. Pauline Maier even described her own visit as having, quote, the air of a state funeral. So whatever meaning you take from your visit, the experience is heavy. Second thing I keep thinking about is much lighter. It's the smell of the replica declarations they sell at National Park Service and other historic sites. If you've ever purchased one in a gift shop, you might know what I mean. I can't even describe the smell, but it's distinctive. And one of the interesting elements of those replicas is how derivative they are. Of course, they're not on parchment, but instead a cheaper treated paper made to look like parchment. And the design isn't based on the original Declaration. What they copy is the stone engraving from 1823. Both of those memories reinforce how much I think Pauline Maier is right about the Declaration being American scripture. The original engrossed parchment is a visual document as much as a textual one, meant to be taken in whole rather than read and dissected. Over the past 250 years, that image has become as much of a symbol of the United States as the American flag, the bald eagle, or the Statue of Liberty. Even if you don't read the words, when you see that document with all its signatures and flourishes, you know what it stands for. You can find information about Pauline and Mary Beth, their publications and work, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/448. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this episode comes from Liz Covart, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what does the signed Parchment Declaration of Independence mean to you? Let me know. Send your thoughts and questions to joe@benfranklinsworld.com.
Psst. You know the stone engraving that Joe just talked about in his episode? Well, the Massachusetts Historical Society has John Adams's copy on display in its new exhibit, 1776 Declaring Independence. And there's still time to come to Boston and see this exhibit. Here's Sarah Giorgini, one of the curators of this exhibit, with more about what 1776 Declaring Independence is about.
Sure. Thanks so much, Liz. Definitely come by the MHS. We are open for free 6 days a week to see 1776 Declaring Independence. Our goal with this exhibit was to walk you through some of the most pivotal manuscripts and artifacts that tell that story from our collections. So you'll see what the mood was like in Boston. You can see some Boston Tea Party tea that we saved from the harbor. You can see the drafting of the Declaration, kind of the room where it happened with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's early drafts of the Declaration with the grievance against slavery left in, which will be familiar to folks who've listened to Brooke Newman just recently chat about it here. And then finally, we considered kind of how the 4th of July has become a beacon of both celebration and protest. And we thought about everything from how Anglicans changed their books of common prayer to paste over prayers for the king and change it to the president, the Congress, and the people, to 19th century understandings of women's rights, of native sovereignty rights, and the cause of abolitionism. And then we finally closed with some very new acquisitions from our No Kings protests here in Massachusetts. So we hope you'll check it out, along with some declarations, because there's a lot of declarations that didn't quite make it into the show, and you can see them online at the MHS website coming soon.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.